Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to everybody. It is welcome to another episode of Times Talks. My name is Caleb. I'm going to be your host this evening. Just very briefly about myself. I'm currently an F1 working in the Greater Manchester region. And I studied at the University of Exeter Medical School. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's episode of Times Talks. So very briefly, just to run through what we're doing here tonight, what TAMS is. So TAMS stands for the Aspiring Medic Support. And we exist for one thing and for one thing only, and that is to support aspiring medics from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. It's that simple, it's that easy. So we do that through various ways. We support students that want to get into medical school, and then we also support medical students once they get into medical school. And we do that through mentoring, we do that through talks, we do that through webinars, and we do that through setting up things like tonight, which is TAMS Talks. TAMS Talks is a series that we've been running for about 12 months now, just over 12 months, and we've run multiple seasons covering a range of topics that are not typically covered in the medical school curriculum. And tonight, we are talking about everything anatomy. But before I talk about what's going on tonight, I just want to give a brief intro into essentially what we're doing this series. So we've, starting last week, we've developed a series called Tips to Jumpstart Your Medical School Journey. And this is targeted for first years and pre-clinical students, because we know that once you start medical school, it can be tough to sort of understand and get your head around all the flurry of new information that you get. People are talking about this resource and that resource. And we just wanted to have a series targeted for these students so that they can make sense of the early stages of medical school. So last week we had the wonderful Henshaw, who led us through how to make the most of your lectures. And if you weren't at that one, you should find our YouTube channel, which is going to be posted on the chat below. So check that out and make sure you listen to Henshaw's talk, because it was packed. Honestly, it was packed with so much value. Can't overstate that at all. So today, as I said, we are talking all things anatomy. The title is How Do I Learn Anatomy? It's a big question. It's a really big question. It's a question I asked myself when I started medical school all those years ago. I feel old now. It's a big question, and there's so many sub questions in that. There's, what resources to use, what are the do's and don'ts, how should I even navigate it, what strategies should I use? These are all the questions that we are going to be posing to our wonderful panelists tonight. So we've got three excellent people who are well versed in this topic. I will call them experts. They may not call themselves experts, but hey, for me, if you're doing an extra degree in anatomy, you're an expert. So I'm going to invite our speakers to introduce themselves. If they could just come online. First, I would invite Ragad to introduce herself. She's a medical student at KCL.
Hi, everyone. Yep. So my name is Ragad. I'm a fourth year medical student at King's College London. And I intercalated at King's College London in the IBSc anatomy degree. And yeah, hopefully give you some tips and tricks by the end of this talk.
Wonderful. That's the plan. That's absolutely the plan. One question for you, Ragad, if you don't mind. Could you tell just a little, just so people can get a better insight into who you are, could you tell us what your favorite dessert is? Just a bit of a rogue one.
Gosh, dessert. I'm going to be true to my background and say baklava. That's where I come from, what I love.
Incredible. I love it. I love it. Amazing. We look forward to learning more about your tips, your tricks regarding anatomy. Omar is who we have next. Omar, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Omar. I'm a fourth year medical student at the University of Birmingham. So I've intercalated in anatomy with Ragad as well at King's College London. So I did it externally. And yeah, I look forward to giving you all the tips and tricks on how to learn anatomy. It can be quite daunting because, of the volume, but actually when you approach it in a structured way, hopefully we'll tell you some amazing tips in this session.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Omar. Same question to you. What's your favorite dessert?
I love, Syrian desserts or Middle Eastern desserts. I don't think they can be topped. So baklava also, absolutely incredible.
Baklavas.
Yeah. But also I do love a chocolate chip cookie as well.
Oh, right. Yeah. Love it. Amazing. And last but definitely not least, we have Tom. Tom, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Tom. I'm from the University of Birmingham. Fourth year medical student, intercalated at the University of Birmingham in clinical anatomy. Weirdly, I actually live with Omar, so if you get feedback from the two of us, we're in opposite rooms, although if one of our laptops dies, we might end up doing this together. I completely agree with what both the others have said, actually. Anatomy can be very tricky and is often one of the ones that seems most daunting, and often teaching can be built for certain people who learn anatomy easily, and so because of that, there's kind of a lot of ways that students often find they find a lot better to learn anatomy.
Yeah, amazing. That's really helpful. And again, same question to you: is it your favorite dessert?
It's got to be tiramisu. Yeah, with some properly brewed coffee on those sponge fingers. Really good tiramisu.
I do love a good tiramisu. That's fine. Now you guys got me hungry. We need to talk about this anatomy thing first before we can eat. So wonderful. No, thank you. And I can see there's a theme here. There's all of you have intercalated in some form of anatomy degree. And first of all, I want to ask about that. Like, what spurred you? I've got other proper questions, but I want to know what spurred you to intercalate in anatomy. Yeah, could you talk us through that? So I'll ask for Tom. You went last, so you can go first on this one.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like, I mean, we'll come on to this later, but at Birmingham, you undertake prosections. You don't do dissection. I know it's different wherever you go, but more medical schools are moving away from dissection. And I felt like I really wanted that experience of doing a proper full body dissection. And so I knew the course at Birmingham, you got a body kind of shared between 4 of you, and you got to dissect that across the course of the first term, so across about a 3-month period. And that's something that I found really, really useful. I've been able to kind of scrub in and go into surgery before that, but I've never been able to just kind of question anatomy in the same way and see anatomical variants. And it's something I found really interesting. We had to kind of write a logbook on that, and I found it a bit of a kind of trials and tribulations at the time, but now coming out of it, I really appreciate it. It's made me kind of look back and be thankful for the person who donated their body to science. But that was a big thing. And also being able to do a project, mine wasn't purely just anatomical, but being able to have that experience away to do something that you're really interested in. I found that a lot of med, you're kind of being pushed through to do the assessments everyone has to do in order to become a doctor, and you're kind of pushed through to do that. And I got to spend time out and kind of almost think outside of that purely med. I have to this test this week and that and that and that and this essay due, and that's something that I really enjoyed. And I'm interested in anatomy. I want to go into surgery, so it fit perfectly. Yeah.
So you just fit all those boxes perfectly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice one. Yeah, that's fair enough. Omar, can you talk about what led you to pursue your intercalated as well?
So, I mean, to start with, I wasn't sure if I was going to intercalate at all. But then if I was to intercalate, the only subject that I was interested in was actually anatomy or anything to do with medical technology. So in my first and second year at Birmingham, we learned a lot about, muscles, joints and movements. And I think that was, one of the things that stood out to me quite a lot because, I do like training a lot. And I think a good knowledge of, how, let's say how your bicep works, where it attaches, where it inserts, and, how is it supplied, how this muscle works, all of that. So that was quite interesting to me. And because I found that I could apply this knowledge even now to help me with my training, to help me, with exercising, not even, I didn't even have to leave med school to apply that knowledge. I could apply it literally straight away as soon as I learned it. And I thought, I'd love to actually find out more and learn about, the biomechanics and learn more applied anatomy. This is why I pursued the degree, in anatomy at King's College London. And I knew they had full body dissection, which is something we didn't have at Birmingham during preclinical years. We only had prosection, as Tom mentioned. But I did it externally because I also wanted a change of scene. Didn't want to just stay in Birmingham because I was there for 3 years and another 2. So.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
That's my reasoning for doing it, really.
That's your reasoning. Thank you so much for that. And how about you, Ragged?
So, as they've mentioned, King's does do the full body dissection from first year. So, as much as I love that entire experience, that only played part of it, I think, for my decision. I think for me, it was more the surgical aspect. So, I hadn't realized at the time that you obviously need that much anatomy for surgery, but as part of the anatomy degree, you get a lot of surgical experience, a lot of surgical teaching. And eventually I got specific surgical exposure to the specialty that I wanted to do. So I think, that's just really the reason. So less so, of course, the anatomy comes with it and the applied anatomy more so, but I think for me, it was definitely from a surgical perspective.
Yeah, it was that interest in surgery that sort of spurred you on to do it. Yeah, no, absolutely. Fair enough. So my next question is, you've all sort of, some of you intercalated internally, some of you went somewhere else. I want you to sort of cast your mind back to sort of when you were first year, first, second year, that time, sort of beginnings of learning anatomy. And, because that's what this talk is targeted towards, people are generally first and second year in the audience. So how was anatomy taught in those initial stages? And did you find it helpful? Did you find that it worked for you? What were the challenges? So essentially, how was anatomy taught in your medical school at the start? And did it work for you? Ragged, could you go first?
Yeah, sure. So we've already mentioned that, thankfully, I think it's a real blessing that we got the full body dissection in our first year. So that was an entire year. I think it was probably like 8 per group of doing proper head to toe dissection. So that was in our first year, and it was alongside weekly lectures, quite heavy material. And I think as great as it was seeing the actual dissection and seeing the anatomy like physically in play, it was a lot of content, especially in your first year of medical school, when you've got so much already going on, to have those weekly lectures of very in-depth anatomy. So I think the lectures could have been adjusted in terms of content so that it just included the relevant stuff, so to speak. But I think that's just how we were taught, and it was just a little bit, you have to figure it out yourself what was relevant at the time.
Yeah, fair enough. No, thanks for showing us that insight, because as a first year it can be certainly a lot, not going to that section room and just getting that. It's a lot of stimulus. How about you, Omar? What was it like in Birmingham, and how did that work for you? And what were the pros and cons of how anatomy was taught in your med school?
So anatomy at Birmingham, so the way it was taught, we had lectures. So first of all, we had in our first and second year, we had modules. So it was all divided into modules, and alongside every module, we had the anatomy that applies to that specific module. So let's say we had the muscles, joint and movement module, and that we learned, where we had lectures about the anatomy, but we also had some small group teaching about the anatomy, the muscle anatomy, the joint anatomy. We also had, let's say, CEP, which was endocrinology, and then we had related anatomy that's related to endocrinology. So let's say the anatomy of the glands, the thyroid, etc. So this is the way anatomy was taught at Birmingham. And then we had also a regional anatomy where we learn it, more by, region by region. So head and neck, abdomen, thorax. We did not have full body dissection. Unfortunately, I, seen it done at King's. I think it was absolutely incredible to actually be able to dissect. We had pro section, so we'd go in and there'd be spotters, and they'd say A is this, B is this. This was one of our exams at the end of the year where we have to name A. What's the function of A? So we have just a dissected body in front of us when you have to kind of label the components, etc. Whether I thought that was helpful, I don't really think so. I think the lectures that we had were overwhelming. We had probably some lectures would have 100 slides. Some lectures would be delivered over 2 hours, and they would be very, very long, very disengaging. I think learning anatomy kind of needs to be a bit more interactive. So in that term, I don't think the anatomy teaching was the best at Birmingham, especially in the preclinical years, unfortunately.
No, that's fair enough.
Tom can tell you more really about it, but yeah.
I mean, I was going to push that to Tom as well, because obviously you went to them in Birmingham as well, and what were your thoughts on how it was taught and whether it was?
My perspective's actually changed quite a lot on it, having done intercalation, having done full body dissection. I feel as though my viewpoint now is that it's very difficult to do full body dissection when you're preclinical and you haven't had a large amount of exposure to anatomy anyway. I say large amount. When you're kind of third year, you should at least retain some of your anatomical knowledge. And so I feel as though the people donate their body to science, and it's kind of changed my viewpoint to the way of thinking that if people don't understand the anatomy purely because they haven't been taught in a great amount of detail yet, then is it respectful of the people who donate their body to science to kind of donate their bodies to someone? I mean, there's the argument we've all got to learn somewhere, but at least the way they were talking to me about Birmingham and about doing intercalation was, you get the opportunity, some anatomy, and so now we want to give you the chance to do full body dissection. I know places treat it differently, but I think that the advantage of pro section is that the specimens are really clear, and also if you have exams on pro section specimens, if they're the same pro-section specimens, you know what's coming up, and like they're normally quite clear. So rather than you doing dissection and you being tested on a pro-section where it might look completely different, you're being tested often on the same samples that you've done already. I would actually agree with Omar though, having been through preclinical with him, that it's quite it's very difficult to make anatomy teaching very interactive without that dissection element. I mean, there's those 3D tables and stuff which we used briefly. They seem to be more of a bit of a gimmick in terms of a table that is like a big iPad, and I never found them actually that useful. What I found really useful was using tools like what's it called? I'm just complete anatomy. So stuff like that, where you can really envisage the whole body in terms of 3D. Because I think otherwise it becomes very disjointed, the disjoint between a regional anatomy module, if you have one, and then the individual anatomy sections of the other modules, like Omar was saying about endocrinology, having a bit of anatomy, but it not being regional as such. It's like you learn the anatomy of the thyroid and maybe the blood supply, and it's hard to interrelate those all without something to bring them together.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I like what you say about, treating the dissection with kind of this respect of, having it later when you have a bit more knowledge on anatomy. I think that's a good insight, and one that I haven't heard before, and you don't really hear about. Oh yeah, so thanks for that. So coming back to you, Ragged. So I want to ask, so now, because in the audience, we have, all the students that are trying to come up with all these strategies to learn anatomy, and this is now into your kind of study space. We've talked about what happens in the lecture room, whether it works or whether it doesn't work for you. So we're going to have people all over the country at different medical schools, and they will, in those medical schools, they sort of teach anatomy differently. It may work for them, it may not work for them, but in your study time, could you walk us through what strategies you find, Ragged, that works for you, and that you would advise a younger student on?
Yeah, sure. So I guess with me specifically, and I guess it might apply to Tom and Omar, we did anatomy learning, or at least I did personally, in two parts. So obviously I did it in first year when we had the anatomy teaching from the uni, but then in my BSc last year, I was forced to do it again, basically on my own, because I'd forgotten everything from first year. And I think both times really showed me the difference between getting taught from the university and getting taught by myself. So in first year, as I assume quite a lot of medical students do, we're very used to being spoon-fed. We make a lot of notes. We make quite very detailed and heavy notes that can be quite hard to compromise, especially anatomy. So we're so driven to learn everything about the body that it just becomes too much to actually physically learn. So I think last year, the BSc really put into perspective the whole idea of clinical anatomy. So using anatomy only when it's clinically relevant. So it's fine if you know like the terminal arteries of, I don't know, like all the way down to your fingernails, but clinically, do we actually need to know all of that information? So my study specifically, what I was doing this time in May was using Teach Me Anatomy. I think quite a few people might know about it already. I downloaded it on my phone because you can get it as an app, had it on my computer, had it on my phone and was making notes on my computer. And then I would do, using the article, I would make questions that I then answered. And I feel that's just a personal learning tool because I can actually actively recall when there's questions rather than just blank notes. So I would definitely recommend, it takes time, especially in first year, but having an insight or some like very brief insight into would I need to know this as a doctor can definitely skim the large volume of anatomy that I guess anatomists really do know.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. That question of would I need to know this as a doctor, so relevant. No, thanks for that. Omar, can I ask you the same question to you? Yeah, so you're speaking to a younger medical student, first, second year. You've done intercalation, you've done first year, so you've kind of gone experience from both. What advice would you give to a younger medical student in terms of strategies that have worked for you?
So my biggest advice actually, and not just in terms of learning anatomy, but in terms of learning throughout your preclinical years, I found it very hard in the first 2 years first year especially, to find out a way that works for me. So when in your first year, you're thrown into a cohort of, I don't know, 300 people, 350 people, and you see so many people just typing out long notes, or some people doing crazy stuff, and you think, and you always tend to compare yourself to other people and think, why am I not doing this? Why am I not revising this way? Why am I not learning anatomy this way? So you see some people who draw amazing diagrams, and I do not know how to draw at all. I'm not a good drawer at all. I try. We had a mock where we had to draw the vertebra once, and the feedback that I received was, this looks more like a fish than an actual vertebra. So that obviously didn't work for me. Drawing didn't work for me. So what I recommend for a first year or a second year medical student is find out what works for you best. You're going to have to, it's a trial and error method. You're just going to have to try. So try memorizing stuff. Or if that doesn't work for you, maybe try using websites, try using the apps. So an app that I recommend, just like Tom said, this is called Complete Anatomy. And I think we're approaching Black Friday. Normally they have a good sale on Black Friday, so you can get it for like £10.
Or your uni might have a subscription.
Or your uni might have a subscription, but I don't think the majority of unis do. Birmingham does. So check if there's a subscription for that. It's a 3D anatomy tool where you can kind of look at a specific region, and it's more superficial, kind of the anatomy that you can visualize. It wouldn't really tell you about the anatomy of the carpal tunnel or this stuff, but it's good to visualize stuff and kind of put it into perspective. But find out, when you're learning anatomy, there's going to be so much, like, you can go into too much detail, and sometimes the detail is not necessary. So when you're learning anything, you just make sure you are relating it back to clinic, like find out the clinical application of this. So you're learning about the your inguinal so your inguinal ligament. So learn about hernias, learn about direct versus indirect hernias, how the anatomy differs in terms of that. So kind of try to relate everything you learn into an anatomical, like into a clinical perspective. So ask yourself, so how is learning the anatomy of the carpal bones is going to help me? So you can find out more about, there's fractures, or you can get like avascular necrosis. So you just have to always relate it back. But also in terms of learning, you just have to find out a method that works for you. Don't compare yourself to other people, because that will put you down. You'll see people who you think are doing amazingly. Like, we had people in my first year who I thought, oh my days, they're making like 30-page notes for each lecture or for each anatomy topic, and then I thought, this guy girl is going to get the best in anatomy, and then they failed it at the end of the year. So it just shows you that when you compare yourself to other people, it just puts you down, and these people might not actually be doing better than you. So just focus on yourself, try to find a way that works for you. You have to experiment. So I will learn differently to how Tom learns. I will learn differently to how Ragad learns, and Caleb, and so on. So you have to find out what works for you best, and that only happens by trying out as much as possible. And it's going to be trial and error. You might try for like a week or 2 weeks and find out, this doesn't work for me. Move on, no problem. Move on to next thing, and you eventually you will find a way that works for you. And that's actually the biggest tip in terms of anatomy learning, physiology learning, anything in med school. That's literally what I would have wanted to hear as a first year medical student.
Absolutely. Look at that. That's just wisdom for med school in general. That's just, thank you so much for that, Omar. That's incredible. And I would certainly echo what you said. There can be just, med school it's a bubble, isn't it? There's so much going on. This person's doing that thing, this person's doing that thing, and it's like, you just focus on your own lane and focus on what works for you. That's such good advice. Coming to you, Tom, as well. So kind of your nuggets and advice on what works for you, and and what advice you'd give to a younger student?
Yeah, I'd really reiterate what Omar says. I know from having lived with him for the last 4 years that we work in completely different ways. In that I like to annotate a lot of my work. So particularly for something like anatomy, if there's a lecture on anatomy, I won't sit and type notes. I find that typing notes is a really, really unproductive way. I mean, it's probably better for the environment. I've got stacks of paper everywhere, but I really like annotating everything because then I can really visualize it all together. So say if I'm being taught through the carpal tunnel, I can write my own notes there. It's a point that I would say for medical in general, for preclinical lectures, is I used to print off the slides. And I mean, now even, I think what I would have done is rather than getting a laptop before uni, got one of those really kind of like good iPad Pros or something similar, like a Surface, because then I can put all of the sheets on a screen and I can draw on it. And that's what I find goes in a lot better. And apparently it's kind of, there's a bit of evidence behind it that if you're writing out stuff with your own hand, it's better than typing it. And I find that really useful. And then I go away and make concise notes. So like what Ragad was saying before, there's often a tendency as kind of high achievers. I mean, people should not doubt themselves in medicine. They're already amongst kind of the smartest people to kind of be in the country, to be doing medicine in the first place. But we've got this tendency to kind of want to do everything right 100% of the time. And it's kind of getting into med school, you realize that's not going to be possible all of the time, even however hard you try. And it's making those condensed notes that is really, really, I find really, really useful. And I didn't actually use complete anatomy a lot when I was preclinical. I started using it more actually when I was doing my intercalation because I got a free subscription through uni. But what I used to use was the flashcards a lot, the Grey's Anatomy flashcards. I used to find them really, really useful because you're testing your knowledge quite regularly. And I think the problem with anatomy is that often it can become quite rote learning, kind of understanding all of the muscles in the forearm. It's really important, like the guy said, to relate it to clinical scenarios, but to actually know what muscles they are, you have to kind of rote learn all of those muscles to start with. And flashcards and doing it in pairs is a better way of doing it than sitting in a room on your own, kind of trying to recite all of the superficial flexor compartment. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, all those trying to memorize so much. Gosh, the memories.
Yeah, particularly in first year when you have to do all the limbs, or at least in Birmingham, you know all the muscles in the limbs. And it gets a bit painful doing it on your own and suffer with someone else rather than on your own, is what I'd say. Yeah. Everyone will be in the same boat as you.
That's true. It is so good. And that's why I love this. I think we've had such a range of kind of thoughts and people have approached it differently, and I think that's what's so helpful. If anything, that's a point in itself. It's like, we have 3 people here that have all doing amazing things in their med school journey that take different approaches in how they learn anatomy, and I think that speaks for itself in itself. The other thing to mention is so if you have any questions, just pop them on the chat. We're monitoring the chat, so we're going to have a dedicated Q&A time afterwards. I've got a few more questions to ask. But we're going to have a dedicated Q&A, so just post the questions and I'll keep an eye on them. All right, so next question I wanted to ask is, you guys have been so good. You've given us resources, given us tips, you've given us online resources. I want some time of vulnerability now. So Ragad, I'm going to come to you next and ask, I think what can be helpful is just to tell people what mistakes or errors that you made in your early journey as a young medical student. Because I think when you tell people what you got wrong, it's like, okay, they can try it, but just to be aware of kind of pitfalls and stuff. So if you have any sort of pitfalls that you went through that you would advise someone else to avoid.
Yeah, so I think, looking back, I was definitely one of the students, even though I would definitely advise not to do so. I was the kind of student who had a 30-page Word document on anatomy for some really, really weird reason. And I think looking back, I guess it is difficult when you're a medical student, because as much as you would in biology come across this sort of stuff, you don't really come across it in so much detail. So I think a lot of the notes that I was making was like learning cell membranes, transport channels, really nitty gritty, like names of enzymes and proteins that you don't necessarily need to know. So I think definitely a big mistake at the time was, I guess, yeah, it's easier said than done knowing what's relevant to an extent. And I think I was also using, one of the reasons why I had so much knowledge was, well, not knowledge, but so much information was because I was using multiple resources at once. Lots of like overlapping ideas, or lots of different like contradicting information that just threw me in the mess half the time. So I think if you can find a really, really good resource, one that is concise and still detailed to your university specific and just like general clinical relevance, and I think everyone here has mentioned really good resources, just stick to that one resource rather than using 100 different textbooks or online resources, or visual aids is fine, but in terms of the actual information, just stick to one.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. No, thanks for that. No, it's a good point, because you can, at the start, you almost have to cast the nets really wide, and then you have to reel it back in. But no, thanks for sharing those. How about you, Omar? Any sort of mistakes that you made in the early stages?
So I guess the mistakes probably relate to what I said before, is comparing myself to other people with the way they work. That was my biggest mistake, my biggest regrets. And every time I speak to a younger year medic who just joined the university, I always tell them not to do that, because that's my biggest tip. And also, and know that we all learn differently, we all perform differently. Some people might need 2 hours and they'll cover a whole module or half a module, but some people might be spending 15, 16 hours on that. We all work differently, our brains work differently. There's no easy way for learning. We need to also realize that, unfortunately. There's no magic spell that like this, I can learn anatomy this quickly. Unfortunately, you have to sit down and dive into your notes or someone else's notes. And but I would say always look at your learning objectives that you set out by your own university. And when you're studying and when you're making notes, make sure that what you're making notes on relate to your learning objectives, because and it's better to have more generic knowledge about 10-15 topics or 10-15 anatomical regions than knowing very, very specific info about one topic, because you're more likely to get asked about the generic stuff, especially in your preclinical years. You're not going to be asked about tell me the exact name of this ligament that's in between in between the carpal, the lunate and the hamate. You're not going to get asked that. So try to have a more generic view of anatomy, where you learn learn more quite broad. So don't learn in too much depth, but make sure you cover more content, more regions, etc., because you might be spending hours and hours on this one topic, and you can go on for as long as you want. There's a huge number of resources, and you think you want to cover like the head and neck region, and you can spend years doing that, and you don't have that much time. You have plenty of stuff besides anatomy that you have to do in med school. So your learning objectives are going to be what guide you. Put before making notes, put them at the start of your Word document or whatever. Just print them out or save them, and then make sure whatever you're making notes on or whatever you're looking at relates to these, because that's the best way to do it. Because sometimes I never really, I think that's my mistake. I never really looked at the learning objectives in my first year, and I realized I was just learning stuff that I didn't really need to learn, and I wasn't learning the stuff that I needed to learn. So this is my one of the biggest mistakes that I did. So don't fall into that pit hole.
Big, so big, so many nuggets. The other thing, we are collating, there's so many nuggets of wisdom here, using learning objectives, making sure you're taking a generic view rather than going into like the into a rabbit hole basically of anatomy, which medicine has so many rabbit holes. You just keep finding more and more if you want to keep going. So it's really helpful. We're going to be collecting some of these sort of nuggets, so to speak, into quotes, and we're going to be posting them on socials. So obviously, keep an eye out on that. So thanks so much, guys. You're dropping gems right now. Tom, I'm coming to you just and then we'll go on to some questions I've got from the chat. So Tom, just some maybe some mistakes that you made as well in early years that you can talk on.
I think as with anything in medicine, it's kind of, you look at the amount of knowledge that you have to know in the amount of time that you have to know, and it feels really, really unrealistic to know that, like to cover certain things in a week or in a few days. And it's a matter of kind of compartmentalizing it, at least for me, is in, all right, today I'm going to start myself off easy and learn about an easier aspect of anatomy. And that's what I always find when I'm going to do revision, is that I will always start with at least one easier topic to ease myself in. I'll never start with quite the hardest thing. I know there's some people that go, I like to do the hardest thing to kind of get it over and done with. But I find I leave the hardest to the end because I remember it the best. But what I used to find is I'd compartmentalize everything. So maybe if I was doing the leg one day, I'd go through the extensors at the knee, because it kind of exists in the thigh, so like rectus femoris and stuff like that. And then the next day, I'd go through extensors at the ankle, so dorsiflexors at the ankle, and I think about it like that. Maybe not quite kind of a day on each, but I really compartmentalize it so that it's easier for me to remember. I feel as though if you go in and go, well, there's this muscle and this muscle and this one, this muscle there, it gets very overwhelming very quickly about learning about insertions and origins and all that. The one thing that really stressed me out and something that I really struggled with was learning muscles, because I find it a lot easier to understand kind of GI anatomy than I do about muscles. But it's as soon as you compartmentalize it and you think about where it's going from and to, it becomes a lot easier to think. If you think about the action of a muscle, so biceps flexing at your elbow, you know straight away, like Omar said, maybe you don't need to know exactly where it inserts, but you can think more generically. Well, one insertion is going to be one side of your elbow and the other insertion is going to be the other side of your elbow. Thinking about it logically like that and compartmentalizing it is a far easier way to approach. And then the very precise insertion on a particular kind of tuberosity or whatever is the more finer details, which become relevant then maybe once you go over it once again. So that's how I approached it. I'd kind of do a sweep of it first to try to compartmentalize it and then go for the finer detail.
Yes, I totally get that, because I think in the later years of medical school, I started looking into the research into what works for learning and what works, and I learned that when you're trying to learn something, it's good to sort of start with what you already know, start with the basics, because it's easier to attach new information onto something that you already know, right? So which is kind of what you're saying. It's like, get the broad stroke first, the stuff that comes easy, so to speak, and then you can attach the fine details onto that rather than just trying to dive in. And then you get stressed out, and then then you get hungry, and then it's like, I'm just closing my laptop, I'm done with this.
Yeah, you want a tiramisu or a baklava.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it's so helpful. Thanks so much for that, Tom. Wonderful. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here. One question is asking about Quizlet. Now, someone, I don't know, no one mentioned Quizlet. Someone mentioned flashcards. I believe it was you, Tom, actually, that you found that helpful. I think Quizlet essentially offers a similar, it's a flashcard resource, and I think you can use it for questions. Has anyone used Quizlet before? If not, do you have any sort of online resources that is helpful for like flashcards and making questions and stuff? Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I never used, I've maybe it makes me sound a bit old-fashioned. I probably am compared to a lot of people in my year. I prefer using a physical resource because I can write on it straight away. I found that unless I was able to get kind of something on my phone and get something there that I could put in that size, I'd rather do it where I've got it mobile. And the Grey's Anatomy flashcards are quite good because you can, like I said before, compartmentalize them. They've got to come with a binder, I think. I'm not paid by them to promote them, but you could do maybe you can do like the leg section and they're all a certain color, so you know what you're looking for and you can take those off. And what I used to do often is I'd sit in the garden, so that I'm not just sitting in my room the whole day, maybe at the end of the day or something like that. So I'm actually taking a bit of a break, but I'm also kind of going through something, and it's kind of, if anything, going in a bit more passively. So I found that those are really useful. I've never really used Quizlet. I mean, I use stuff like past medicine, but it's not something I've used for anatomy. I feel like anatomy, what's really useful is either flashcards like that or an atlas. An atlas is kind of something that's really good, and I think is neglected a lot by medical students. People go, get an atlas, and no one gets an atlas until they have their prosec exam, and everyone tries to get the same atlas a week before their prosec exam or something like that. And so that's a good way of learning, is because often the things will be numbered, they won't be named. And if you cover up all the numbers and you try and go through and you think, you can start, maybe if you've gone through anatomy lectures already, you can go through and start labeling and go, well, I know that the IVC is on the right hand side, whereas the aorta is on the left, and you can start kind of to relate even from the basics like that, and then you can build it in and go, well, what level is the superior mesenteric artery, and build like that, and then look at all the different labels as numbers, and you can start to build a picture. And it will come slowly at first, but that's no bad thing. There's no bad thing in getting it wrong to start with, because you only learn by getting things wrong. You don't learn by getting everything right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a quote in itself, you know. What you just ended with, that you could post that. I'm loving it. I've got a question here. I'll pose this to, well, just for everyone, and anyone can answer it. Is how did you handle sort of being overwhelmed / catching up with anatomy learning? Because we can be kind of scared by the volume of it. So sometimes you get overwhelmed, sometimes you're behind. So how did you handle or cope with this?
I can answer that, because I was at the stage, especially my first year, where it was April time, and my exams were in a few weeks, and I had huge amount of content to really learn within these few weeks, and I was very overwhelmed in that period. But I do think that pressure makes diamonds, and I work best when I'm under some pressure. But the way to do it is, if you feel like you're at a point where you have a lot of content to cover, you need to first of all find out what's the most important things for you to cover within this time. So if you think you're not going to be able to cover everything, you're going to have to find out what's important to learn. So you're going to have to work smart, and so working smart is more important than working hard, but it's going to be a bit of a combination, working smartly and hardly at the same time. So as I said, learning objectives, also asking all the years, so what comes up in exams, are there any past papers? I know a lot of med schools don't offer past papers, but you might be able to find unofficial past papers, and I think those can be unbelievably helpful. I mean, a lot of the time questions recirculate in medical school because the lecturers are too lazy to write new questions. So I think finding out what comes up in exams that can tailor what you're studying into specific aspects, so you can focus more about, if you know that this area comes up quite often, so let's say the head and neck comes up quite often, so you might focus on that and slightly, but as I said, don't dive into too much detail about specific stuff. Try to get more of a generalized knowledge, because that's what you need, especially as a preclinical. No one is expecting you to know the fine details. These can get you some extra marks sometimes if you have an essay, an anatomy essay, etc. But you need to know your basics, because if you don't know your basics, you're not gonna, knowing these fine details is not really going to help you much pass your exam. So find out from all the years. Try to find some past paper questions, and you'll be fine. Always trust that with some hard work, and you will be fine. And if you're under pressure, just realize that pressure makes diamonds. That's my motto. Pressure makes diamonds.
Pressure makes diamonds. Jeez, that alone, I'll take that. Love that. Raga, did you have any thoughts on that as well? Just about being on the pressure and stuff.
Yeah, I think it was mentioned earlier, I think by Omar, towards the beginning of the talk. It's definitely not just with anatomy, with medicine in general, and also Tom mentioned it. It's really hard because we've come from this mentality that, okay, or at least me as well, we need to know everything. We're doctors. It's gonna fall on us to know everything. And especially with anatomy, when you've got anatomists doing the lectures, they've been studying for sometimes 40 plus years. Like we had Alistair Hunter, who is like a legend in his name in anatomy, who's been doing this sort of teaching for 60 plus years. And he was giving us information that obviously he's going to know because it's his job, basically. I think a big thing when you're feeling overwhelmed, when there's not much time, when there's so much content, you really need to take a step back and give yourself a break. And it's really hard because of our medical mental perspective. We have this mindset that I need to be studying 24/7 to get everything in, but it really is like needed during exam time to turn off the laptop, even if it's for like, I don't know, whatever floats your boat, like 30 minutes, an hour, whatever you need to just recharge. Because after I don't know, some people do crazy long sessions, like 6-hour sessions, nothing's going in realistically by that point. So by giving yourself a half-hour break, or even just a 10-minute refresher, have a call with someone, get a drink, it really helps. So I think when you're feeling overwhelmed, yes, keep studying, don't just give it up, but give yourself a break as well.
Absolutely. So such good wisdom there. Honestly, sometimes taking a step back in itself just refreshes you, gives you insights, gives you foresight, and then you can kind of chart the way forward. So thank you so much for that. Okay, with interest of time, we're kind of running out of time now. So no, this has been so good, guys. And so many nuggets. We've had our team members sort of jotting down all the kind of take-home messages and stuff. But I wanted to have one last round from everyone. And this is essentially your one take-home message that you would give to students. And then this would be a last one, and then we'll close up at that point. So one take-home message that you would say, remember this, when you're studying for exams, when you're, you're just saturated with all these lectures you're trying to navigate, like what would be your take-home message from today? Anyone can go first.
I would say, I think that it's a combination of making that time. So I don't know, for me at least, planning my day and setting reasonable objectives, not setting objectives which are way too much. I mean, sometimes there will be content where you can't cover absolutely everything. I remember I started first year and I did all the further reading at the end of every single lecture, and I thought, God, are we meant to be doing this for every single lecture? And realized quite quickly that you really do not have to be doing that. But and getting books out of the library that are written by all the professors and going, oh, this is really interesting. But I think setting yourself reasonable objectives and a plan for the day is a way that I like to learn. So I go, well, I want to cover this amount of lectures this day. I'm not going to say I'm going to cover 20 lectures in a day, because then if I only cover 10, I'll be disappointed. But you've probably done pretty well if you've covered 10 in detail. And it's not a matter of whizzing through the content. It's about knowing it and having that active recall and that application, particularly for anatomy. So compartmentalizing it and learning in loads of different ways. So maybe going through your lectures once that is about the basic anatomy, and then building that up with going through flashcards, and then maybe attempting the surgical lecture on the forearm, or maybe on hand surgery or something like that. And then you've got that layer, like you said at the beginning. So then you've got 3 different layers to the same topic, and they're probably often in a module. That's probably often designed to be that way, as in you've probably maybe got 3 lectures on the same topic anyway. So it's a good way of doing it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tom, for that. And I'll come to Omar next for his sort of one take-home message from you.
So my take-home message would be, find how you learn best. Don't compare yourself to other people, and back to Tom's message plan. So make sure you have a plan, but also don't beat yourself up if you don't achieve that plan. Is it's not the end of the world, and get some advice from friends from all the years. And yeah, Teach Me Anatomy is your friend as if you want to learn anatomy. I think it's a really good website. I know some anatomy demonstrators might dislike it, but I think it's actually a really, really good website, and it's very well designed. Has a good, it doesn't go into too much detail. I think it goes just to the right level. So I think it's very useful in your preclinical years. It should be your friend. So download their app, as Ragad said. It's very useful. Has some quizzes sometimes as well to test your knowledge. So it definitely is one of the best websites to learn. So make sure you use it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Ragad, could you just give us your take-home message as well?
Yeah, sure. So gosh, I think echoing what everyone has said, obviously, it's been they've given really great gems. I think so definitely just remember that anatomy is always going to be there. So there's no harm in just taking a step away from it, even for a day, for however long you need. You're always going to come back and find its glorious kind of annoying face in there at all times. And yeah, when in doubt, if because it is online or COVID still hitting the dissection series, just use your own body. So you've got your limbs, your body, at least for me anyway, like especially muscles, it's very, very useful to almost visualize it on your own body, how your body is moving, which muscle is responsible. And that way you get your clinical knowledge in as well. So when in doubt, use yourself.
When in doubt, use yourself. I love it. You've got anatomy as well. That's it. Wonderful. That's so good, guys. You guys have been incredible, like absolutely fantastic. And I think just taking me back, if I attended this in first year, I'll walk away with like just walking around in my head like massive, like all this knowledge. But it's so good. So many resources you guys have recommended, and and I think it's helpful to kind of see how you all kind of approach it from different areas. People use flashcards, people use questions, lectures, in so many different ways. And I think it's been helpful for our audience to just say, okay, these are all the ways I can do this. Now let me now figure out which one works for me. And everyone has to do that hard work of figuring out which one works for you, and then you just really leverage that system that works for you. So thank you guys so much. It's been really good. And yeah, we've had some really good feedback as well. It's been absolutely wonderful, and absolutely fill in the feedback. Our speakers obviously would love to kind of get some kind of feedback from everything they've said, and how it was all set up. So thank you guys so much for availing yourself this evening. And before we head out, the other thing to just plug is that we are not stopping here. There is another episode in this mini series called Tips to Kickstart Your Medical School Journey, and that's going to be next week. We are having a wonderful. I'm not going to tell you what we're doing, because I'll let you find out what's happening next week. It is going to be incredible. We've got another speaker. Hint, she's a BMA rep. Oh, mad. She's going to be speaking to us on a certain topic, and how to jumpstart your medical school journey. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, join the community, and just get involved in all that Times is doing. And I just wish you all a wonderful evening. And yeah, bye-bye.
Before we go, just one thing, a bit of a plug for actually Tom, not for me, but Tom with my other housemate are running a podcast called Med Time Stories. So check that out on Spotify and Apple Music. It actually just talks about kind of their med school journey, and it's short episodes. You can listen to them on your way to placement or med school. It's called Med Time Stories.
That's very kind, Omar. I only paid you 20 quid to say that, so you didn't.
Love the plug. Absolutely check out Med Time Stories, guys. I'm going to even have to have a look as well. That sounds really cool. bedtime, get it? Come on. All right, Faisal, take it away. Thank you so much, guys.
See you later. Take care.
Thank you.